Welcome to the final video in the series, Fastest HDRI for VFX equals Ricoh Theta Z1. Hey guys, it's Alex Pierce from LightsailVR.com. Make sure to subscribe to get more videos like this. This series covers how to use the Ricoh Theta Z1 to capture HDRIs and how to add CG objects to live action footage. In the previous videos, I showed you how to set up your Ricoh Theta Z1 with the new HDRI plugin. We talked about shooting considerations in the second video. In the third video, I showed you how to do camera tracking in Syntheyes. And in the fourth video, I showed you how to set up your HDRI and camera tracking in Blender. In this video, I'll show you how to render, composite, and finish your project in Blender. I'll give you some tips on improving your materials, on rendering glass, and show you the basics of using the compositor right in Blender. Okay, let's jump in.
All right, so now we want to talk about rendering. There are many different ways you could render this. You could set up different render layers. You could render Cryptomatte and different layers and composite it all in one pass. But for the sake of this video, I'm just going to render them all as separate images one at a time. And before I start the render and go to bed, what I want to do is render out all the necessary layers separately and then composite them back together to make sure it looks correct. So let's go ahead and do that. So the first thing we want to do is we want to render the car by itself. So if we just turn off everything else and we turn on transparent, this looks okay. But if you look through the glass is always, transparent objects are always weird in 3D programs. You can see that the background is actually not correct. If we turn off transparent, that looks fine, but if we turn on our camera screen, you can see that it's actually a different background than our camera screen. And if we just turn off our camera screen, it's incorrect. So what we need to do is, instead of turning off the camera screen, we can go up here to the filters and turn on this indirect only. And then under the camera screen, instead of turning it off, turn on indirect only. So now we see that the background through the window is correct, and we can render this by itself. So I'm going to go ahead and save again. And we'll go ahead and, for now, we're going to turn down the samples. So to the render tab, turn off viewport, render. I'm going to turn this to 128 so it renders pretty quick. Go ahead and save again. I always save before I render, so I'll go ahead and press F12 to render just the car. Yep, that looks okay. One thing you notice is that it's not sharp at all. And this is something I do a lot. I actually render a higher resolution than what I need, and then I scale down. I think it's called super sampling, but right now we can't read this. This is supposed to say something, but we can't read it. So I'm going to go to slot 2, and then back in Blender, if I go to the output tabs, I can change the resolution, but I can also just put 200%, and that's going to render twice the resolution of 1080. So let's go ahead and press, we're in slot 2, let's go ahead and press 2, F12 to render. Now you can see this says Quadro very clearly. I want to turn off denoising as well. I'm going to go ahead and turn off denoising now. Render, and then render denoise off. I never use denoise when I'm doing animation. If I need to do any denoising, I will do it after the fact. So now if we look here, we can read that it says Quadro. If we come back here, everything just looks sharper. If we come back to slot 1, you can see everything is just not as sharp. If I zoom in, you can't say, you have no idea what this says. So that's fine. So I'm going to render at twice the resolution, and that's fine. Okay, so this looks okay. I'm going to go to Image, Save As. I'm going to go to Exports. I'll do Car 3. And then I will call this Car. And I don't recommend PNG. I actually recommend OpenEXR, RGBA, Float, and then DWAA. There's a lot of different formats, and that I can save that for another time, but this will be basically similar to PNG, but better. Just take my word for it if you don't know. I'm also going to change that now under the format here. I'm going to change the output. I'm going to change this to OpenEXR, RGBA, Float, DWAA. And now that will be the default when we render our animation as well, and I won't forget it. So we've saved the car. Now let's do the shadow catcher. So let's open up the shadow catcher. And same thing here. If I turn off the car, if I turn off, let me go ahead and turn off the camera screen. If I turn off the car, the shadow catcher has no shadows to catch. So what we need to do here is keep the car on, but turn on indirect only. And when we turn on indirect only, we can see we have these sharp lines. And that is because our shadow catcher is not big enough. So basically, we just want to make sure that we scale that shadow catcher up. I'll turn on overlay so you can see it. We'll scale this shadow catcher up to be bigger than we need it. So now if we look at our edges, there's no shadows all the way at the edges, and that's what we want. So once again, I'm going to save. I'm going to choose slot 3 and then render. You can see that we're on frame 7. It's important that your test renders are all in the same frame or else they will not line up. All right, so we got our shadow here, save as. Call this shadow. I'm going to switch to slot 4. And now let's do the camera screen. So if we switch the camera screen on, turn off indirect, turn off our shadow catcher, this is what we want to render. F12, image, save as, call this background. All right, let's now composite those together. So if I go to compositing, use nodes, we can drag these in, car, shadow, and background. You can do this however you want, but I like to stack it how I would in, say, Photoshop. So I know that I want my car on top of my shadow and both of those on top of my background. You can do Shift-A search viewer to add a viewer node. And now if you drag this in, you can see what it looks like. And you're going to do Shift-A search alpha over. Shift-D to duplicate that. And basically you want the car image. This one is going to go in the bottom, and then the shadow is going to go in the top. Now if we bring this over, you can see the car is on top of the shadow. That looks correct. So we're going to do the same thing here. So the background is going to go on the top one. The alpha over is going to go here, and then this is going to go there. And now we have our composite. You can press V to zoom out or Alt V to zoom in. And that looks pretty good. So now what we can do is just so we can see, the main thing that jumps out to me right now is that the car is too bright. I saw that earlier, but I wanted to bring this up in compositing. So if I do Shift-A, add color correction, I'll just add this to just the car. I can turn down the gain. Now I can dial in the brightness of the car. So this is, so this is with the color correction applied, and that's without. So it's a subtle difference, but it makes a very, very big difference in terms of how realistic it looks. So now let's go back to layout. I think that composite looks good. So what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to test a few more locations. So I might test this one at the end and one here in the middle, but then I'll go ahead and render out. So what I'm going to do to render is I'm going to render out the whole thing once for the background. I'm going to come back to Blender, render out the whole car, come back to Blender, and render out the whole shadow pass. You could absolutely do this with render layers, and there's other ways you could do this through compositing, but if you don't know how to do any of that, just do it one at a time. That'll be fine. So I'm going to go ahead and save, and then I will render this out. So the other thing you might want to do here is go to your output tab and choose an output. So I'm going to just go here, put it under car 3, say accept, and I'm going to render the background here. Let's go ahead and save, and then when you're ready to render, just go up to render and then render animation, or use Control F12 to render. So I'll go ahead and render these, and we'll come back and composite them. Okay, now it's rendered. If you're going to do your comp in Blender, I recommend creating a new Blender project from scratch. And then if you go to the Compositing tab, click on Use Nodes, delete the render nodes, and now add in your image sequences here. So Shift-A, search for image, open, navigate to your render,
Click on the first one, open image, and then here under single image, change this to image sequence. And then if you're not sure how many frames, you can just put in a bigger number than you think. And then you can use the timeline down here to scroll and find the end. I know this is 1260, so I'm going to put 1269. I'll go to the end, and you can just go backwards until you see the last image. So for me, again, I know it's 1260, so I'm going to set my end to 1260. And for my frames here, I'm going to also set this to 1260. And then you can click on Shift Control left mouse, and it'll open the viewer. You can press V to zoom out, Alt V to zoom in. Okay, so we got our car here. Let's go ahead and add in our others. Okay, so now we can do Shift A, search for alpha over. And if you remember, what I like to do is take the top, middle, bottom, put them in order, and then the order goes like this. And then you can do Shift Control to look at what that looks like. And then do another alpha over. Shift Control. Now we have our comp. Now you can add color here. To do color balance, I can take down the gain a little bit from the car, etc., etc. Then you want to make sure that your image also goes into the composite. And then let's go ahead and press F12. See what it looks like. So this looks like it's too zoomed in, and I think I know why. If we go to our scene, you'll remember we rendered at 200 the resolution. So we can just do that again. Now if we press F12, yeah, that looks better. Our frame rate was shot at 5994, so let's go ahead and change it to that. And then you can go ahead and render this out if you want. I'm actually going to composite and do a little bit of roto in a program called Assimilate Scratch, because at the end of the shot you have this object that obviously should be in front of the car, and you can roto in Blender, but I prefer to do it in other programs. So let's quickly look at that. So this is what my project looks like in Assimilate Scratch. If I just turn off all these layers, you can see what I'm doing. First, I did the color space transform, and then I also did some color correction to the background image. And then you can see I've added the shadow here, and you can scrub through the timeline and look to see what the shadow looks like. And then I added the car. Same thing with the car. I could also do some color correction on top of that. I want to take it down just a little bit more. Something like that looks good. And then I added this roto, and actually it was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. So basically all the roto does is it puts this yellow cone in front of the car. And the way I was able to do it was actually pretty simple. I was actually just able to use this qualifier to choose this color and then use that as the matte and put that in front. So I'll go ahead and render this out and we'll see what it looks like. Okay, here's the final shot. And it looks pretty good. I can see some things I would change if I really needed to deliver this to a client, but I think in general this looks great. The reflections look really nice on the car. You can see all the trees, you can see these yellow pillars, you can see them reflecting really nice in here. The chrome looks pretty good. I think I would add a little motion blur. I think I would change the color a little bit, maybe make the car a little bit less reflective. But overall, I think this looks really good. Okay, that's going to wrap up this video. Let's recap everything we've learned in this series. In the first video, I showed you how to update the Theta Z1, install the new HDRI plugin, and I went over the basic settings to shoot your HDRIs. In the second video, I gave you some basic VFX supervisor tips, like taking measurements, shooting dirty plates with gray balls and chrome balls, adding tracking markers, and more. In the third video, I taught you how to use Syntheyes to do camera tracking, otherwise known as camera solving or match moving. I showed the automatic way and the manual way, otherwise known as supervised tracking. In the fourth video, we covered how to bring it all together in Blender. I taught you how to light CG objects with your HDRI, how to import the camera tracking data, and how to add a shadow catcher. And in this video, we went over how to render, composite, and finish your project in Blender using the HDRI we created with the Ricoh Theta Z1 and the new HDRI plugin. I hope you've enjoyed watching the series as much as I've had creating it. I'm sure you can see why I think the Ricoh Theta Z1 is a must-have tool for people working in the VFX industry. Let me know if you have any questions, and if you found this series helpful, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any content. Okay, see you in the next video.